What are Chinese characters? How many do I need to learn? And what's the best way to learn them? Hey, my name is Luke Truman and I want to do a first video in a 4-part series on learning Chinese characters. In the first video, I will cover what exactly are Chinese characters. In video 2, I will cover some recommendations and courses and methods on how to start learning them for yourself. In video 3, I will cover the best tools available to assist you with reading Chinese. And finally, in video 4, I will cover the best types of books for beginners, plus some personal book recommendations and author recommendations from stuff that I like myself. First of all, what are Chinese characters? They're just pictures, right? Well, yes and no. You see, while some Chinese characters are pictures, the vast majority are not, and this common trend in representing Chinese characters as pictures in some courses to make Chinese seem less intimidating is not just misleading, it's wrong. Chinese characters are made up of smaller components, building blocks. Sometimes these are referred to as radicals, but more on that in a second. These smaller components are put together to make characters. This is similar to how parts of words come together in English to form bigger words. For example, the word bilingual is made up of bi, meaning two, and lingual, meaning language. We can recognize that the part bi in a different word also means two. Like for example, bicycle means 2 wheels. If we change bi, meaning 2, to tri, meaning 3, then we get tricycle, which means 3 wheels. This is very similar logic to how smaller parts of characters are combined to make characters in Chinese. One thing to clarify before explaining the different types of characters though, is that characters are often equated to words in English. So again, while this is kind of true, this doesn't really paint the full picture. In classical Chinese, there was more or less one character equating to one word, but the written language has evolved a lot since then. More ideas and more abstract concepts were formed, the characters started becoming combined in new ways to form a lot of 2 or more character words. Most words in Chinese today are either 1 or 2 characters long, but there are some exceptions, most notably being names and also 4-character idioms known as chengyu. So let's take the word ni hao as an example, meaning hello. This word consists of 2 characters, ni, meaning you, and hao, meaning good. Literally translating to you good. Both of these characters by themselves are standalone words, but also when combined have a different meaning. Each of the characters also holds its own sound. One character equates to 1 syllable. However, the same character in different contexts can sometimes have different pronunciations. This type of system is called a logogram. Another notable example of a logogram is Egyptian hieroglyphics. So then, if most characters are not pictures, what are they? Characters were first classified into 6 main categories, also known as liao shu, and this is part of the Shuowen Jiezi by Shu Shen. And this is basically a dictionary in the Han Dynasty, which was the first to analyze the structures behind the characters. From there, most modern courses today teaching Chinese to foreigners explain only 4 types of Chinese characters. However, if you go to the Confucius Temple, like I did when I was in Taipei, you can see the text explaining what the original 6 types are. In this video, I'm going to go through the most common 4 types of characters, explain what radicals are, and then go through the final 2 that get skipped out of most textbooks. So type 1, pictograms, xiang, sheng, or form imitation characters. Roughly a total of 600 characters are pictograms. That is, a character that look like a drawing of the thing they are trying to represent. For example, mu is tree, huo, fire, ren, person, ru, sun, shui, water, and so on. This is also the reason why sometimes Chinese characters get referred to as pictures. Sometimes though, because of the evolution of the character, it's not immediately obvious what the pictograph is. For example, can you guess what this character is? Well, this character means bird and is pronounced niao. The original character looked like this, and then eventually it evolved into this. Also, sometimes the meaning of the character will differ slightly from the original. For example, mu, the original meaning of tree, now it is more commonly used to represent wood, while the modern character shu is often used to mean tree. Type 2, simple ideograms, or 指示 indication characters. While pictograms represent basic pictures, ideograms represent basic ideas. For example, the character for 1, 2, and 3 are these, and the character for up looks like this, pronounced shang. The character for down looks like this, pronounced sha. Type 3, compound ideograms, or 会意 joined meaning characters. This is when 2 smaller characters are combined together, combining the meaning of both to form a bigger character. For example, shou has the meaning of to rest. It's made up of person, ren, and tree, mu. Here, you can imagine a person leaning against a tree in the shade, resting after a long day's hard work. Note when ren is on the left side, the character's appearance is altered slightly. These changes tend to be fairly regular, and once one starts learning characters, this is something you get used to very quickly and shouldn't cause too many problems. Another example of a compound ideogram would be lin, This character is made up of 2 trees side by side and has the meaning of forest. Type 4, phono-semantic compound characters, or 形声, meaning form and sound. This is when one element gives a hint to the meaning of the character while the other element gives a hint at the pronunciation. These make up the vast majority of characters in Chinese and can often lead to native speakers being able to guess the meaning and pronunciation of a character with some degree of accuracy based on the context. For example, lin means to drip. On the left we have water, 水, and again with a slightly different appearance as it's appearing on the left side, and on the right we have lin, meaning forest. Here, water gives the meaning of to drip, whereas forest, lin, gives the pronunciation. Often with phonosemantic characters, the meaning is on the left and the sound component is on the right. Also, these often follow very distinct patterns. For example, most vegetables, cai, have the component for plants on the top, while the bottom half is the pronunciation. Another example, often body parts have the component for flesh plus the component for sound. Like in tui, flesh gives the meaning of body part, while tui gives an indication of the pronunciation. On a final note, due to the large sound changes since the Chinese characters were first invented, sometimes the original etymology of the character is not clear by only looking at the Mandarin pronunciation. Leading researchers have had to research links between other languages that use Chinese characters, such as Cantonese, Japanese, and Korean, to help gain a complete understanding of the history of the characters. For example, the character he in Mandarin means river. The water on the left side gives the meaning shui, but the sound component in Mandarin is pronounced ke. In Mandarin, he and ke sound completely different, but in Cantonese, the character meaning river is pronounced ho, and the sound component is pronounced ho. All this means for us as a learner is that sometimes it will not be clear where the sound of the character comes from, and we just have to accept that, learn the character, and then move on. So, radicals. The term radical, or 部首 in Chinese, meaning section head, specifically refers to the 214 small components that are used to organize characters into dictionaries. Each character only has one radical, no more. The other parts are simply components used to derive meaning and are not used for organizing dictionaries. Often radicals hold some clues to the meaning of the character, but this isn't always the case. Sometimes the radical, which is what the character is organized in the dictionary by, and the smaller component, the part of the character that gives it its meaning, are not the same. This means unless you want to learn how to use paperback dictionaries, it's best just ignoring the radicals altogether and focusing on learning the parts of the character that give it its meaning. Let's look at an example. Mei, meaning beautiful. The radical for this character is yang, meaning sheep. If we use the radical to break down and understand the character, we would assume that the meaning of mei, beautiful, has something to do with sheep, and the other component, da, meaning big, is either a sound component or another meaning component. Because da sounds nothing like mei, this has led people to believe that the meaning of beautiful is derived from the meaning of big plus the meaning of sheep. There are even some stories that teach this, saying there was a competition where the biggest sheep was the most beautiful and therefore won the prize. But this makes zero sense. What do sheep and big have to do with the character beautiful? They don't. This is because breaking down a character by its radical to understand it doesn't always work. The concept of a radical didn't even exist until 1,500 years after the 说文解字 dictionary was first introduced. This means that characters had already been around and studied for thousands of years before radicals were even invented. So in what world does it make sense that radicals are used to understand a character? Taking the example of Mei, the original form of this character was actually a pictographic representation of a beautiful woman wearing a headdress. Over time, this has changed into the two components we see today, sheep and big, and only later was sheep used to categorize the character for dictionary purposes, which is what we call the radical. The final two types of characters as described in Liu Shu are rarely talked about, and they're a bit more complicated than the previous four, so it can be a little bit harder to get your head around, but they still make up an important part of Chinese characters. So type 5 is rebus, or phonetic loan characters. In Chinese, jia, jie, or borrowing characters. Rebus characters follow the rebus principle of using one character to write something down that has the same pronunciation. For example, the character you in Chinese originally had the meaning of right, but was then later adopted to mean again, due to having the same pronunciation. Yo. As yo adopted the common meaning of again, changes were made to draw a distinction between the two characters, adding the mouth to form the character we use today, yo. Type 6 and the final type, 转注, derivative cognates or reciprocal meaning characters. So this is the least understood type of character, so I'm just going to do my best to explain what I know. Derivative cognates, also known as transfer characters, are characters with meanings influenced by other words, sometimes called mutually explained characters. So the rules of transfer characters are as follows. They have to exist in a pair or group and cannot exist as a single character. Both characters have a shared component, both characters have similar pronunciations, and you can use the characters to mutually explain each other. So the difference between transfer and rebus characters is that transfer characters stemmed from having different characters but the same meaning, whereas Rebus characters stem from having the same character but different meanings. Additionally, transfer characters have similar sounds, whereas Rebus characters, the sound is identical. The most common example is Lao and Kao. 属现说转注者见类一手同以相受 Kao Lao shi ye. As I understand it, first came the character Kao, meaning old. Later on came the other adaptation Lao with the same meaning, old. So the Kao component in the first character Kao, as well as the B component in the character Lao, both have the meaning of walking stick and show an old man walking. Because Kao and the word for examination or test have the same sound, later on the character Kao was adopted for this meaning, changing to how we use it today, like in the word Kao shi. Meanwhile, the character Lao kept the original meaning given to Kao to mean old, like in Lao Ren. So simplified versus traditional characters. Chinese characters started being used thousands of years ago, with the earliest known set recorded being the Oracle Bone script, getting its name from Chinese characters engraved onto animal bones, eventually evolving into the two sets of standardized characters that we use in modern Chinese today. Traditional Chinese characters, or Fantizi, have been used since the 2nd century AD and are currently used in Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, as well as most overseas communities. Simplified characters, Gentizi, started gaining traction when the People's Republic of China started to promote them during the 50s and 60s as an effort to increase literature rates in China. They are the official written language in mainland China, Malaysia, and Singapore, and the most common type of character in use today. Because of large influence from mainland China, most second language schools outside of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan use simplified characters. However, the one noticeable difference is that traditional characters are still typically used widely, even in China, for activities such as calligraphy. Other languages using Chinese characters, most notably Japanese, use a combination of both simplified and traditional characters depending on the time of the period they were borrowed. Japan also underwent some of their own character simplifications for some of the commonly used characters, which means you can have multiple forms of the same character, one for traditional, one for simplified, and one for Japanese. So for example, the character qi, meaning air, in traditional Chinese looks like this, simplified Chinese looks like this, and Japanese looks like this. So should I learn both? In my opinion, when starting out, it's best to only focus on one, simplified or traditional. Learning one will allow you to progress faster to reading subtitles, testing with your friends, and reading books. Even though there are some characters that look completely different, because of the large overlapping characters that are the same, a standardized simplification process, and the fact that you already know all the words, you just need to learn the characters, the jump to learning to read the other form once you already know one isn't that big. Do I have to learn to write tens of thousands of Chinese characters? Whilst there are over 50,000 Chinese characters in existence, a lot of dictionaries barely list over 20,000. Most educated native speakers know somewhere between 7 and 10,000, and about 3,000 characters is enough to cover 99% of written Chinese today, which is estimated to be enough to read most newspapers. But the good thing is, living in the digital age, thanks to computers and phones, there are lots of phonetic input-based methods, or IMEs, such as pinyin, zhuyin, or yuping, that you can use to type characters without ever learning how to write them. If you do choose, however, to learn how to write Chinese characters, there are two additional points worth noting. Firstly, although the complexity of a Chinese character and the number of strokes can vary massively, every single Chinese character still only takes up the same amount of space on the page when writing, so there is effort needed to keep them all a consistent and uniform size. Secondly, is that every character has its own stroke order, that is, the characters are not drawn randomly, rather there is a correct stroke order for every stroke in the character, and when looking up a character by drawing it out by hand, via dictionary apps such as Pleco, large deviations away from the standard stroke order will most likely cause you problems when trying to find the character you're searching for. Once you learn the basic stroke orders, however, this becomes fairly intuitive, so it may be worth learning to write at least a few hundred characters for this reason alone. Standardization of the Chinese writing system. Firstly, although there are many different variations of Chinese in existence today, all official documents like books, newspapers are all written in standard Chinese. This is the same across all locations regardless of if the Chinese native language spoken there is Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, or something else. The grammar and vocabulary used in standard Chinese is for all intents and purposes the same as Mandarin Chinese. This can be used for written communication where otherwise spoken languages would not be mutually intelligible. However, languages like Cantonese can actually be written down as they're spoken, different from standard written Chinese, repurposing some of the characters based on their sounds. For example, this character meaning to connect in standard Chinese, in Mandarin it's pronounced shi, but in Cantonese it's read hai, and can be used to mean to be, the same as shi in standard Chinese. Also, the introduction of some specific characters to Cantonese has led to Cantonese being able to be more accurately transcribed, having some forms of Cantonese written literature starting to emerge in recent years that Chinese non-Cantonese speakers wouldn't necessarily be able to understand. Books in Taiwanese Hokkien have also started to emerge in recent years, with things like The Little Prince being translated. So thank you so much for watching. It's probably a lot of information to take in at one time, but hopefully it's enough to give you at least a basic understanding of how Chinese characters work. For gaining a better understanding, I will cover some more methods methods that I recommend for learning Chinese characters in the next video, video 2 of this series. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it useful, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share it and all that good stuff, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.